Hello and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to talk about exception handling in Python. A Python program terminates as soon as it encounters an error. In Python, an error can be syntax error or an exception. In this lecture, we'll see how the exception is raised or how it is differed from the syntax error. And after that, we'll just learn about raising an exception and making the assertion. Then we'll just see about the try and accept and obviously the else and finally block. So let's get into it. So first of all you have to do is open your IDE and create the new script for this lecture. So there is a quite difference in exception and a syntax error. So first of all, let's see what is the difference in this exception and the syntax error. So syntax error occurs when the parser detects an incorrect statement. So let me give the example over here. Let me see print statement, and if I just say O divide by O, which is obviously the invalid, and let me just give here that is print that statement, and let me just give one more that is parenthesis. Instead of just a single, I have to just give one more extra. Then if I just hit enter here, so it will say invalid syntax. Instead just giving this 0 by 0 is invalid, it will just say invalid syntax. So the arrow indicates here when the parser ran into the syntax error. So this line is basically the red because the parser has ran into this syntax error. So this is our syntax error, which normally is due to this statement error. So let me use this same print statement, but this time I'll just say O and divide by O, and let me just remove that one, that is one extra parenthesis over here, and let me just hit enter here. Then you could see 0 division error, division by 0, which is obviously the mathematical error, and this time you have ran into the exception, which is an exception error. So this type of error occurs when you just make a syntactically error, or basically Python code results into the error. So last message over here defines what type of exception you are into. So you are into the 0 division exception. When you make this except to catch this 0 division exception, when I just say 0 and division, let me just say division, and let me just go with the error, it turns into something purple over here. That means it is an keyboard, or it is an defined in this Python. That means 0 division is defined. If I just say name error, let me say name error, it is also defined, which is an error exception in the case of the Python. So this is a critical difference between exception and our error. So instead of showing the message exception error, Python will detail here what type of exception it is. Basically it is 0 division exception. In this case we have seen this 0 division exception, and Python comes with various built-in exception as well as the possibility to create the self-defined exception, which will be seen in the upcoming lecture. So first of all, let's see how the exception can be raised. So we can raise an exception if a condition occurs. The statement can be complemented with a custom exception. So you can see here we can raise the exception, we can force or raise to force an exception over here, and we can use raise, which is our keyword, that is all in lowercase, raise, to throw an exception if a condition occurs. So let's get into this code section in order to get a good grasp on how this raising an exception occurs in the Python. So let's get back into this shell where we'll just create the new variable, which is x equal 10, and if I just say if x is greater than 5, let me just say if x is greater than 5, which is basically a condition where the exception can be raised. So I'll just make use of this raise keyword all in lowercase, and I'll just say exception, which is basically an exception class. Now we can make our own message to the user, which should be like this. Let me just give one message. Let me say x should not exceed 5, and the value, let me format it, and the value of x was, so in this case it would be obviously the exception because we have given the value of x to be 10, and basically we have raised exception if it is the condition, that is x is greater than 5. So let me just format it first. So let me use this format statement in order to format this x value, and let me close this exception class. So when I just hit enter, you could see the message that is showing that is exception x should not exceed 5. The value of x was given as a 10. So we can raise this exception using this raise keyword. So it is really important to know the program also comes to halt and display this exception to screen, offering us a clue about what we went wrong by this message which is formatted over here. So we can just see how this exception can be raised using only this raise keyword, and based on this condition we can raise this exception and also give the clues about what went wrong and how this can be rectified. Now it's time to talk about handling the exception. So in order to handle the exception, we have the try and accept block. So this try and accept block in Python is used to catch and handle the exception. So in this try block, you run the code which might have the exception, and the exception occurs is normally handled in this accept block. So Python executes the code following the try statement as the normal part of the program. The code that follows the accept statement over here is the program response to any exception in the preceding try clause. That means when an exception occurs in this clause, which is basically a try block, that means it should be handled using this accept block. And we can make use of different exception class, which can be name error or zero division error, with this exception to catch particularly verified or particularly defined exception with this accept block. And as we see here that in this case, when syntactically correct code ran into the error, Python will throw an exception error, which was basically a zero division error. So this exception error will crash the program if it is not handled. Basically, if it is not handled and if you just ran into this code error, it means your app will be crashed. So we have to handle this using the accept clause, which determines how your program responds to the exception. So we'll just make a function that can help us understand this try and catch block. So let me define the method here, which is our function Linux interaction. So I'll just say Linux interaction method here, and you know how to define the function, and I'll just assert that is the message over here, and let me assert this as Linux first of all, and I'll just say it should be Linux, and in, which is a keyword to check for this platform. So let me say Linux and platform. So basically in the case of a Linux, this assert statement is going to run, otherwise it have to give the message that is going to be function can only run on Linux system. So let me just give this message to the user, and if you just now go down over here after this assert, and I'll just say print me just doing something. So let's see how this will act. Basically, if I just give this assert, and this statement, basically this Linux in sys.platform statement is the function going to run only on this Linux system, but I am on this Windows. That means it is not going to print us the results. So it will just see how this Linux interaction will work. And let me just go back here, and basically what we need to do is we have to just call this Linux interaction. So let me just go down here. So let's go down here and let's call this Linux interaction, which is our method. And if I just say Linux interaction, then you could see name error, name sys is not defined, and it is basically giving us an error which is saying sys is not defined, and obviously this sys is not imported first. So let me just import this sys first, which is in system module, and let me just copy this all of this code and let me just paste it down here. So it should be, let me just copy those, and after this copying and just pasting it over here, let me just press this one more time, and let me just call this Linux interaction method one more time, and let me just call this down, and it is going to show us assertion error function can run only in this Linux system. So I'm on the Windows, that means I'm just giving this assertion error, and this assert in this function is basically throwing this assertion error exception if you are calling this operating system other than the Linux, because we don't have a Linux over here. So the usage method is wrong here, so it is just showing us assertion error. So we can give the function a try using the following code, which can be using the try and catch block. So you could see here we are not using this Linux system, that means we are just having the error of an assertion and showing us a error, that is assertion error over here. So in order to just remove this, we can make use of a try and accept block. So how this try and accept block works is, so what I did over here was we just created a new script where we had the same function, that is Linux interaction. And if you could save this one, and let me say that is exception handling over here, and make sure you put this py extension, and let me save this down and print this down, then you could see the same error over here, but we are not printing anything. That means it is not calling, obviously we're not calling this method. So let me just call this Linux interaction method, and we have to just import this sys module to work with. So I'll just say import system, and let me save this down, and you could see the assertion error, the same error. So now this can be handled with this try and catch block. So let me make use of this try now at first, and if I just make use of this try, and let me just give the tab over here and tab for this assert and the print. Now what you need to do is we need to just define this method. So let me just define this one over here outside this try and catch block. It should be defined outside this try and catch block. And now in this try, what you need to do is we'll just put this Linux interaction call in this try block. Now it's time to define this accept block. So in this accept, what we need to do is we'll just say pass. We won't do anything, we'll just say pass. Then if I just save this code and see, then nothing is going to happen because we have ran into the exception, which would be obviously the assertion error. So if you have an assertion error, then you are going to get this pass over here, which is this line of a code, which means nothing is going to happen. So if I just print it is assertion error or exception, then it is just printing us this one, if you could say. So it is saying assertion error. So basically what happened here was, while just running this code, which is basically the code that should be run in this Linux platform, but I'm on the Windows, that means we have an assertion error, and on throwing that assertion error, we won't print this print doing system. Instead we just go in this accept block where we print this it is in assertion error. Instead of crashing, now our programs run, and basically you can just run other code outside of this accept. So let me say doing something. So if I say doing something over here, and if I just print this down, then you could see instead of crashing, you could get it is assertion error, it is doing something. So in the previous lecture, what we did was we just didn't use this try and catch block, and we just simply said Linux interaction, which is our method to be called, and let me just say Linux interaction, and let me save this down and show you. That means it is going to show a assertion error, and it is not going to run this line of a code. That means your app crashes when you don't use this try and catch block. Now when you just use this try and catch block, only this part or the code where the exception can occur is not run, and the code other than that exception is executed. So let me show you again, and it is showing it is an assertion error. Obviously the code where you have the assertion is catch over here and handled in this accept block, and the code that is beyond this try and accept block is perfectly running, like we have seen here in the case of this example. And we have numerous type of exception error, and when it is raised in the case of the file or directory, it is normally called as a file not found error. So let's take the example of that first. So if I just say try the, let me just remove this, all of this. So I'll just say try, and if I just say with open, so let me just open this file, any file, and let me just say file.log, which is not present in my machine, and I'll just open it as, let me say, file. I'll just open this and I'll just call this read data method, and it should be called as file dot, we have something that is read method in the case of the file to read the file, and we have to just read that file and store in this read data. So now it's time to just handle if any exception occur, and the exception that should be occur is file not found, because I don't have any file in this machine. That means it should be file not found error, and I'll just name this error as FNF error. So it should be FNF error, and if I just print this FNF error, then let me just print this down first, and let me just save this code first and show you the error message here. So it should be with, and this should be not dot over here, it should be open. Let me just save this down and run this one more time, or let me just run this in the new console, and it is saying no such file or directory, which is file log. So this is basically our file not found error, which is basically used or mostly used in the case of the file handling technique. So you can use this try and catch block in order to just handle this exception immediately and did not get to the part where you attempt to open the file.log. Now it's the time to take a quick summary of this try and accept block or try clause is executed up until the point where the first exception is encountered. If there is an exception, that means the try won't run and accept will run, and basically on the found error or exception, then the code inside this accept will run. So you can have anticipated multiple exceptions and differentiated how this program should respond to them. Like this, we have done assertion error and we have done this file not found error, and we'll just deal with multiple error handling techniques or multiple error or exception error types in the upcoming lecture. So before that, we have to see something about the else clause. As we have already said, in the try block we run the normal code, and if any exception occur, we just halt the continuation of the execution in the try block, and we reach out to the accept block where we execute the code when there is an exception. And we have now else block, and it is basically no exception. Basically, if there is no exception, we'll just run this code inside this else block. That means try and else block will run at the same time. If there is an exception, that means else block will not be executed. So let's take the example of this else block in order to get the good grasp of the idea about this else block and when this else block code will be executed. Here, while we have this file not found, let me just go back where we had made this Linux interaction method, and in this method we have now the try and accept block. Now it's time to make use of this else block. So in this else, what I need to do is we'll just say print me down, and it should be executing, let me say, the else code. So I'll just say executing the else code over here, and let me just close this print, and let me just save this down first. And if I just save this and show you the message, then you could see that we haven't, okay, it should be double quote over here, and let me save this down again and print this. Then it is an assertion error, which is obviously the error of this assertion. So we have used this Linux interaction, which is not going to execute it because we have an exception, which is assertion error. And if it has an assertion error, that means this code is not going to be executed, and we are not going to execute this else code. So if we want to execute this else code, you have to do something like, let me say, print hello. So if you have here no any exception, if I just say hello, and if you just say here exception, if there is exception, you should catch and just print this one. So if I just save this code, and you could see now you have this hello and executing the else code. Basically what happened here is we don't have any exception, and in the TryBlock we have to make use of this Linux interaction call where we simply print hello. So that means we don't have an exception and no except block will execute. That means else should execute. If there is no exception, else and TryBlock should execute. If there is exception, that means this except block should work and the code inside this else block should not be executed if there is any exception. So that is basically idea about the exception and how this else run on the basis of the exception. And on the basis of exception handling, you can make multiple execution of the code inside this else. So one more important thing in this else is you can just put any the TryAccept block inside this else. So if I just say try and I'll just say with that the same that open function that we did before while creating this file not found error. So let me just say file.log to be searched is file. Let me say it should be file over here, and this should be read, and basically that can be done with this read method. So let me just take this file and read that data, and I don't have any this file.log. That means I'm just getting this exception, and this exception can be caught, and let me just say except, and the exception name would be here file not found error. So let's use this error as FNF error, and we have to just print this down error, which would be obviously the file or a directory is not found. So let me just print this down over here. It should be FNF and error. So if I just save this down and run the code, you could see that is hello is over here, which is obviously our Linux interaction method, and in this TryBlock is executed. That means else is going to run, and in this else try is not going to run because we don't have this file.log in our machine. That means except inside this else is going to execute. That means you don't have any directory is the message that is going to print it, which is our file not found error exception message. So this is our the else part where you can have the another try and accept block in order to handle this exception with separate else block. So now last thing or the last block that we are really interested in this exception handling is the finally block. So let's talk about the finally block. As we seen previously, the TryBlock is the normal execution of the code. If there is an exception, except block is going to run, and if there is no exception, that means else block is going to run. But the code inside this finally block is always going to run independent of any exception. So let's take the example how this finally block code is going to run, which is independent of any exception. In basically we have to just run this code always, no matter how this exception is caught in this except block. So let's take the example and get the good grasp of how this finally works in the exception handling. So you can see over here we have this TryBlock except block. If any exception occur, it should be handled in this except block, and else part will run if we don't have any exception. Now it's time to just put the finally block, and this finally should be written all in lowercase. And let me just print down some message over here. Let me say cleansing up, always run this code, always run this code. So if I just print this down, then you could see no matter what we get, the exception or not, it is going to run. So it is saying cleansing up, always run this code. That is, we don't have exception here in this except block, and else part will run obviously. And in the else part, file not found is the error. That means it is just showing us a error. So let me just take an example where we have an exception. So I'll just say the interaction should be like assert. So let me say assert first, and let me just give the same value, that is Linux, and it should be in, and let me say sys.platform, the before code, that is the code we have just written. And let me just give the message over here, function to be called in Linux. So after this function is provided, what we need to do is print, we'll just say do, and now we have here the assertion error. So that means we can use this except block in order to handle the exception error. So you could see now the finally code is going to run independent of any exception that might occur or might not. So let me just save this down and show you that it is assertion error. So basically if you go back to this code, then that means in the previous code that we have is hello, which was in the case where we didn't have any exception, and we have this no such directory, which was obviously this else part. So if you see here in this later code, that means we have an exception over here. If it has an exception, TryBlock is not going to run. That means there won't be the call to this Linux interaction. This code won't be executed. That means print do won't be executed, but this except block is going to run, and this else part is not going to run, because if try runs, then only else part is going to run. That means if there is no exception, then only the else part is going to run, and here in this case if there is exception, that means else part is not going to run. It is assertion error is printed, which is obviously the message of this except block, which in this case we have assertion error, and the finally is going to run in the case where we just caught the assertion error. It is independent of any exception. This finally code is going to run no matter when you just caught this exception or you don't have any exception. So what if I just say hello, or just let me just pass it over here and let me save this down. You could see now that is no such file and directory is obviously the log, which is the except block over here, which is inside this else, and this finally is going to run no matter what we have here, assertion error or any error. So let me just put here exception, and if I just save this down and run it one more time, then you could see the same message, that is no such file and directory is obviously this message printing over here, and the finally block code is going to run independent of any of the exception that might occur or might not. So now we have just finally reached to the end of this lecture. Before that, we want to just make a quick summary about this try and catch block. So let's get into it. So let's see quick summary over here. So raise allows you to throw the exception at any time. So we make use of this raise in order to create the exception, and we use the message to give in order to just show the clue about what the exception was using this raise keyword. And assert was enables you to verify if a certain condition is met and throw the exception if it isn't. So we had take the example of the condition where we make the variable assigned to 10, and we just assert the statement or assert basically if there was an exception or condition is valid or not, and basically based on that we just throw an exception. And in this try clause, all the statements are executed until an exception is encountered, and in the accept block it is used to catch and handle the exception that are encountered in this try clause. And else let your code section that should run only no exception are encountered in the try clause. That means if try clause run, then only the else clause will run. If the try clause just encountered the exception, that means else clause is not going to run. And the finally block enables you to execute section of code that should always run with or without any previously encountered exception. That means finally block code is independent of any exception that might be handled or unhandled in this accept block. So this will be the wrap for this lecture. See you in the next one.